I've gotten a little bit more fixed up this morning, maybe taken a shower or something. So sorry anybody online that has to see me in HD. So for anybody who I haven't met, my name is Dr. Ann, and we've been doing this course, Food is Medicine, now for over 2 years. And when we first started this class, all of us doctors kind of got together because, you know, looking at the diet and looking at food is such a fundamental piece to getting well that you can almost make the statement that you can't get well unless this piece is actually addressed. And so everything we're going to talk about today hopefully will provide a framework for you that, you know, everything you hear you can kind of fit into this framework. And so I like this class to be real discussion based. So if you guys have any questions, please stop me. You know, we have an outline that we'll try and get through, but I'd rather get your guys' questions answered so that you can get out of the class what it is that you need, and and hopefully we'll get through all the different slides. I love this quote: "The food you eat can either be the safest and most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison." And diet is one of those things, kind of like with a lot of habits. You know, sometimes we feel an immediate effect, but sometimes we don't. But yet we do know that the accumulation of a poor diet over many years can lead to a lot of the chronic diseases that we're seeing today. And so when you think about your food as medicine, that can make a really powerful switch in your mind as far as what choices you make about what you're eating. So where we're headed with this class, we're going to spend the most amount of time on this first section talking about inflammation, and we're going to talk about how the diet connects today. And then that'll take up about 3/4 of the class, and then with the time we have left, we'll actually start talking about leaky gut. Has anybody heard that term before? It's becoming more well known, so we'll talk about specific strategies you can use to actually heal the gut. So before we jump in, I like to do a little bit of a review of the anatomy of digestion, because for most people it's a little bit of a mystery. You know, it's kind of like, this is like a black box. You know, we take something that's very appetizing and very delicious and we eat it, and then it comes out something that's not quite so appetizing and not quite so delicious. And so, you know, a lot of times we don't know what's happening in that in-between phase. And so I like to kind of go through this so that that we kind of understand what's happening. Does anybody know what is the very first step in the digestive process? Any thoughts? Chewing, mouth, which is absolutely true. You can't physically digest something until it's in your mouth. But I always argue there's one step hydrates. There are a lot of sensory cues. When you taste sweet, for instance, your body's going to prepare for sweet by releasing insulin. So even if you have something that's sweet like stevia, you know, that tastes sweet but doesn't have any calories, your body's still going to start mounting a little bit of an insulin response because it thinks it's getting something sweet. Same thing with bitter. When you have a bitter taste on your tongue, you know, in nature, bitter foods tend to be harder to digest, or they're poisons. And so the body prepares for bitters by releasing more acid in the stomach. And so, all those sensory cues we get in the mouth, you know, with taste are very important with, you know, preparing the rest of the digestive process. And you'll see that as we go. You know, each step in the process kind of prepares the next step. And so if you have an issue kind of in one step, you're going to see repercussions of that all the way through the digestive tract. Yes?
Pickles.
Yes.
Is that an alkaline?
So the question was, pickles, are pickles alkaline? I mean, pickles are typically, you know, they have more of the vinegar, you know, with them, so they tend to be a little bit more on the acidic side. But when you talk about alkalinity and acidity in the body, you know, there are certain foods that, even though vinegar is more acidic, doesn't necessarily put the body in a more acidic state. Same thing with like citrus fruits. Citrus fruits are more acidic, but they can have more of an alkalizing effect on the body. So, you know, so that it's kind of a different conversation depending on, you know, what it is you're looking for as far as pH. And so, But that's a great lead to the next step in the digestive process. Once you chew the food and it goes down the esophagus, it goes into the stomach. And the stomach is one of the few places in the body where it's actually appropriate to have a very acidic environment, because it's the acid's job in the stomach to break down proteins. And I think of proteins, proteins are made up of what are called amino acids. And amino acids, to me, are kind of like little Legos. They're different shapes, they're different sizes, and you can use those amino acids to build a lot of different types of proteins in the body. And so the stomach's job is to break down the proteins into those amino acids. So if you've got a weak acid system in the stomach, you're not going to break down those proteins. And if you're not breaking down those proteins, you're leaving yourself more prone to developing sensitivities as they move along in the digestive tract. So the stomach is a really important point, and we'll talk about this more later in the class, but one of the most readily prescribed drugs these days are the acid blockers, because it seems everybody has acid, problems. What's the guy on TV that, for the Prilosec, he's like, yeah, Larry the Cable Guy, it's like, yeah, you can still eat your hamburger, and fries, just take Prilosec. And, that acid is your body trying to communicate a symptom to you. And a lot of times, interestingly enough, when you have the symptom of reflux, it's actually too little acid in the stomach. And the reason that is the acid triggers the closure of a sphincter right here. It's almost like closing off a balloon, that when acid levels rise, that sphincter at the bottom of the esophagus closes off, and so it contains the contents of the stomach in the stomach while it's churning. If you don't close that sphincter and it remains, open a bit, when you're churning the food in the stomach, you're going to get a little bit of reflux. And so very often the symptom of reflux is either too little acid or food sensitivities. You're creating an inflammatory response, and you're eating a certain food that's creating, that symptom. So, the other thing that when the stomach acid is released, that is also a triggering mechanism for the pancreas to release pancreatic enzymes. So has everybody heard of digestive enzymes? Sometimes we take them with our food. The reason we take those enzymes is because we're assuming that we're not getting enough, the pancreas isn't releasing enough of those enzymes. But the pancreas is triggered to release those enzymes based on the amount of stomach acid you have. So if stomach acid is low, then you're not going to be releasing a lot of enzymes, which makes sense. If stomach is preparing for the next step in the digestive process, if stomach acid is low, enzymes aren't going to be released, and then we end up with a lot of undigested, poorly digested food that doesn't get absorbed well, and that, if you've ever seen undigested, food material in your stools, or if you have bloating after you eat, very often that is a stomach acid pancreatic enzyme issue. Because the pancreatic enzymes get dumped into this part of the small intestine called the duodenum. And as those enzymes get dumped in, those are the enzymes that help us break down specific carbohydrates, specific fats. Like, for instance, if anybody's ever known someone who's lactose intolerant, the reason they can't handle dairy is they don't make enough of the lactase enzyme, which is what helps us break down milk proteins. And so that's one specific example of an enzyme, but there are lots of other enzymes that help us break down our fats and carbohydrates and other proteins. So then as the food, it gets broken down in the stomach, it continues, as you add the digestive enzymes to get broken down, so that by the time it gets to the small intestine, which is this snaky thing here in the middle, this is where you have the majority of your absorption. So this is where the body absorbs sugars, it absorbs those amino acids, it absorbs everything the minerals, the vitamins that are in our food. And this is where we have leaky gut. This is where that issue starts to occur. And so if this system isn't working, we're not going to be able to absorb, the nutrients that we need. That's going to continue the cycle of, inflammation in the body. So then as the food moves through the small intestine, you get to the colon, which is also called the large intestine. And, at this point, its main job is waste removal. So this is where you're flushing out all of the excess waste that the body, doesn't need. This is also where you have the largest population of bacteria. So if you ever have heard the term microbiome, or, if you take a probiotic, this is where a lot of that that bacterial system resides. So much so that, sorry, this is before lunch, but when you have a bowel movement, about 75% of your fecal matter is actually bacteria. So you can start to see if you've got issues with constipation, there's probably something going on with the ecosystem, in that large intestine. And so, all the waste kind of makes its way through, and then hopefully at least 2 to 3 times a day, we're having a bowel movement to help remove that waste. So I feel like the world would be a different place if we were everybody was pooping every day, getting rid of that waste, because if it sits in the colon, some of that waste can get recycled, back into your system. And so waste removal, if you get nothing else out of the class, try and ensure that your diet is such that you are having multiple bowel movements per day. And most people feel better, when they're doing that. So any questions about this before we move on? Okay. Let's see. So one thing, before I kind of jump into talking about inflammation, one thing that I'm going to kind of keep going back to when we talk about this class is understanding kind of what our digestive system and what our biochemistry evolved to be, because when you look at our ancestors, they ate a very different diet, and they ate that diet for thousands and thousands of years. And when you look at our diet today, within the past 50 to 100 years, we have radically shifted our diet. And so it's almost kind of like we've shifted things so quickly, we haven't given our body a chance to catch up. And so what we're going to look at is, what was our body designed to do? What sort of food was it designed to break down in the digestive tract? What were we designed to use as fuel? And we get a lot of clues about that based on what our ancestors ate. And so beyond just eating a different diet, some of the other things that they did differently is, talking about the sensory system, they were much more reliant upon their senses to determine what they were going to eat or not. Because for them, if they were in nature and they had the choice between 2 berries, if they chose the wrong one, that could be a poisonous berry, that could be the end of their life. So they were very discriminatory about what they actually put inside their bodies. And, it's thankfully we've gotten to the point where, we can go to the grocery store and we can buy anything at the grocery store and assume that it's probably not going to kill us immediately, and it's safe for consumption. And so we've lost a little bit of that a lot of that discrimination as far as what we're actually putting in our bodies. And so taking a second to read labels, to understand where your food comes from, can go a long way as to helping determine what it is you actually eat. For our ancestors, they spent a lot of time hunting and growing and preparing their food. Most of their day was consumed with finding calories. And for us, again, it's an advantage that we don't have to spend our days doing that. But we've, again, flipped to the opposite side of the spectrum, to where we spend no time preparing our food. We don't, prepare a meal. And when we cook at home, a lot of times it's something we're pulling out of a box or out of a bag. And Michael Pollan, who is an author, he's one of my favorites, and he always says, you can eat anything you want as long as you make it from scratch. And if you think about that sort of a motto, that means if you make a batch of cookies, you're not using a Pillsbury, box mix. You are making everything from scratch, and it's going to take a lot longer. And so you're probably going to enjoy those cookies more, and you're probably not going to eat, half of the box in one sitting, because you have more of an investment in that. And so the more we can invest into the food that we're preparing, I think the more satisfying it's going to be, and the better choices we're going to make as well with our food. For our ancestors, meats and sweets were a luxury. And so, again, they always had periods of feasting, versus famine. And, especially when it came to sweets, sweets for them were mostly available in the seasons when fruit was ripe. So, there was only certain times a year where they had, especially the availability of a lot of fructose, which when you look at, how we process sugars, we process fructose more into stored fat versus glucose we use for immediate energy. So for our ancestors, if fruit was available, toward the end of summer, early fall, if that was when it was ripe, it was an advantage to them to have as much of it as they could to build up fat storage for the wintertime when it was wasn't available. So in our world today, we have an abundance of sugar and an abundance of fructose, and we still have the biochemistry of our ancestors where we end up storing about 75% of the fructose that we consume, or more, depending on how much you're having. But yet we are having a constant source of it, which I believe is contributing to, some of the obesity epidemic. And then number 4, the quantity of food that our ancestors ate was less, and this is, something that's pretty consistent in the research, that the less you eat, the longer you live, and I think part of that is, again, kind of going back to our ancestral patterns of they had periods where there was plenty of food, and then they had periods where they, had to, fast, and they didn't have the availability of food. And, kind of the new thinking is it's that flipping between, a state of plenty and a state of fasting, that it creates a little bit of stress in the body called hormesis. And it's that little bit of stress that helps kind of keep us, keep some of our detox and keep some of our, our liver pathways, more active. And so in today's world, since we have just kind of this abundance of food, this excess of food, sometimes intentionally taking a period to fast, it's called intermittent fasting, can do a lot of good to help support detox in the body. Can it help support, balancing of blood sugar? And has anybody heard that term before, intermittent fasting? Maybe a few people. Yeah. So it's this idea that, maybe you pick, 4 days a week where after dinner you don't eat anything, and you don't eat anything until noon the next day. So for a good 10 to 12 hours, you're intentionally fasting and drinking water. And if you choose to do that, it can be an excellent way to balance out your blood sugar. But the secret of it and the key of it is what you break that fast with. So if you start fasting after dinner and you don't eat breakfast, but then you go to McDonald's for lunch, you've wasted that, and you're actually probably doing more harm for your body. But if you intentionally break that fast with a great salad, with greens, with good protein or a smoothie of some sort, then you can have a lot of benefit. And you still eat the same number of calories as you would in a normal day. You just eat them in a shorter window of time when you're doing that. All right, so now we're kind of jumping, since we have a little bit of a framework here, we're going to jump into, how our diet connects with a lot of the chronic diseases we're seeing today. And so, I always pose this question, what's changed in the modern diet that makes us so sick? And there are a lot of things that have changed in the modern diet. But all the things that have changed in the modern diet connect back with this idea that they are all creating inflammation in the body. And so, does anybody know what exactly is inflammation? Because inflammation, I feel like, is kind of one of those terms that we hear about. We know it's not necessarily the best for us, but we don't know what exactly it means. And so, does anybody have an idea? What is inflammation? What does it do in the body? Without looking ahead in your notes. An irritant. Yeah, like what do we feel when we have inflammation? What is typically pain? Yeah, we typically associate pain, maybe swelling, redness, heat. A lot of times, we know what inflammation feels like. But inflammation actually has a very important job in the body, because inflammation's job, at a very basic level, is to break down damaged tissue. So when we get injured, it's inflammation, these inflammatory mediators that come in to help break down the damaged tissue so that the body can then repair and heal itself. So without inflammation, we wouldn't be here. But, we have to make the distinction, because there's a healthy inflammation and then there's also an unhealthy inflammation. And so inflammation can be healthy when it's localized, and when it's visible, we can see the effects of it. And when it's acute, that acute is probably the most important piece of this, because, if you sprain your ankle, it's a natural response to have some swelling, have some heat, have some pain, but you don't want that swollen ankle to stick around for 2 months after you injure it. And so, a healthy inflammatory response is acute, it does its job, but then the body comes in and starts repairing that area. Where inflammation becomes unhealthy is when it's chronic, so it sticks around a lot longer. Think arthritis, anything itis, You know, if you have an itis condition, that's inflammation. You know, so it can be anything from dermatitis, that's just inflammation of the skin, you know, gastritis, inflammation, you know, of the stomach, gingivitis, you know, inflammation, you know, in the gingiva of the teeth, you know, anything itis is inflammation. And so especially if you have multiple itis conditions, you know, that maybe seem not connected, they are connected, and it means you've got an overabundance of inflammation in the body. And that's unhealthy. When inflammation is chronic, when it's systemic, you know, so you have it in different points, and then sometimes it's undetectable, you know, and kind of a classic example of that is cardiovascular disease. You know, a lot of times when we think of plaquing of the arteries, what do we think of? It's a cholesterol issue. You know, we just need to get our cholesterol down, or we need to eat low fat. But in reality, when you look at what causes, you know, the buildup of plaque in the arteries, it actually starts off as an inflammatory response in the lining of the arteries. And it's that inflammation, you know, that starts damaging, and then the cholesterol that's floating by in the bloodstream gets deposited in those arteries. Very well could be a healing mechanism for all we know, you know, in the body. But those cholesterol gets trapped, you know, in the damaged lining of the arteries, and eventually it is the cholesterol that closes off the arteries, creating, you know, the heart attack or, you know, stroke that we see. But it started off as inflammation, and that's something that we don't detect. We don't necessarily feel, you know, our arteries being inflamed, and so. But when we have this kind of chronic inflammation, you can kind of think of it as like a wear and tear of our organs. You know, it's like you're just kind of constantly breaking down, you know, different areas of the body. And so, you know, so ideally in a perfect world, we would have a balance. You know, so we would have the ability to turn on inflammation when it's needed, but then we also have the ability to turn off inflammation when it's not needed anymore. And ideally, we would stay in kind of a nice balance, kind of a moving balance with that. Whereas most people today, it's like this. They have way more of kind of the pro-inflammatory mediators and not enough of the anti-inflammatory ones. And so we kind of stay in this state of chronic inflammation. And so triggering that inflammatory response becomes easier and easier in today's world. And a lot of that has to do with the diet. And so an example I like to give that helps illustrate this is if you had two people, one person who was in a healthy inflammatory state, so they're more kind of balanced, and then one person who's in an unhealthy inflammatory state, if you had both of those people go out and hike 8 miles, you know, hiking 8 miles, that's going to create, you know, some wear and tear. That should trigger a little bit of an inflammatory response. But if the person who's in a pro-inflammatory state, you know, they might, you know, hike those 8 miles. They might be sore that night, and then they're sore for a week after, you know, they finish. So that inflammation got triggered and it stuck around a long time. Whereas the person who's in a healthy inflammatory state, you know, they might have triggered, you know, that same inflammatory response, and maybe they were sore that night and maybe a little bit stiff in the morning, but that soreness went away, you know, within a day or so. You know, that's a healthy inflammatory state where inflammation gets triggered, but then the body is able to kind of balance out that response. And so, you know, you can kind of, you know, classically we think of that, you know, people who are younger, you know, like, you know, you could have somebody who's in their 20s go out and hike and, you know, they're not going to be sore because when you're younger, you know, we are constantly repairing a lot better than we are. As we age, you know, it's not necessarily that we're getting more inflammation. It's just we're not repairing as quickly as we used to when we were young. I see a lot of our pediatric population here, and I see a number of kids that have high inflammatory markers, even though they don't necessarily have the symptoms of inflammation that maybe somebody, you know, twice their age has. And so, you know, that's the one thing that changes as we age is we just don't heal as quickly as we did when we were young. So if you can, you know, theoretically use your diet and use your lifestyle to slow down the amount of inflammation you're triggering, you're going to stay in a more balanced state, and it's not inevitable that you have arthritis, you know, when you get older, that you have some of these inflammatory conditions. But you have to work harder at maintaining that balance than, say, somebody who's a lot younger. Are there any questions about any of this? Does that kind of make sense with inflammation? Okay. So what does inflammation have to do with the diet? That's why we're here, and it's the diet isn't the only thing, but it is the best place to start if you're dealing with a lot of inflammatory conditions, because again, until you address the diet, any supplements you do, any drugs you do aren't going to work as well until you can tone down, the amount of inflammation that's being triggered in the body. And so to answer that question of how diet connects with inflammation, we're going to take a look at kind of how the diet has shifted. We'll start with kind of the ancestral diet, look at what were we designed to digest, what were we designed to eat as food, and then we're going to look at how things start to change when we introduce more grains, when we introduced more refined foods, and then even today where we introduce more processed foods. And what you'll see is as we have these gradual changes, you'll see all these different markers of inflammation start to shift. And it happened over such a long period of time that we maybe weren't quite aware of it as we are today, where we're feeling the effects of inflammation today. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't know how we got this way. Well, this will kind of clearly, show how we've gotten to the place we're at today, where it seems like everybody has something. Everybody's sick with something these days. And I'll point out too, I put some recommendations. This is that author I was talking about, Michael Pollan. This is an old book. He wrote this book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, I think before there was this huge, awareness in the public about, eating whole foods and eating healthy. And so, he's kind of a revolutionary, author, and this was one of the books that he first wrote that really talks about a lot of this stuff. So if there's anything that interests you and you want more information, I tried to put some either documentary or book recommendations for you on some of these slides. So when we look at what connects the diet with inflammation, these are the 4 factors we're going to look at, because each of these 4 things has a significant impact on the amount of inflammation that's triggered with the foods that we're eating. And so we're going to look at, what percentage of our diet comes from a whole food source. We're going to look at the ratio of omega-6 to 3 fatty acids, the glycemic index, and the ORAC score. So I'm going to go through what each of these are, but just know that these are the 4 factors we're going to look at that connect the diet with inflammation and the release of inflammation in the body. So this first one right here, whole foods, eating whole foods. If you get nothing else out of the class, and you don't learn anything else, you tune me out, fall asleep, if you can just follow this one idea, you will cover a whole multitude of nutritional sins that you could commit, if you will. If you can get at least 80 to 90% of your diet from a whole food source, then you're going to be doing better than 95% of people in our country today. Because when you eat a food that's a whole food, that's a food that's in its original state. It hasn't been altered, it hasn't been processed, it hasn't been changed a lot. And the reason it's the best state to eat is that's where we get the most amount of nutrients, most amount of fiber. That's where, it's like nature doesn't do things unintelligently. And so you get in a nice, neat package what, the nutrients you need from particular foods. And so the example I give here is if you look at, say, eating an apple, an apple would be considered a whole food. If you eat an apple in its original state, you're getting all the fiber, all the nutrients that come, with that fruit. Now, if you take that apple and you peel it, you cook it down, maybe add some cinnamon and sugar to it, mash it up, you can make applesauce, which applesauce isn't a bad choice. It's not a bad food choice, but it is one step away from being a whole food. Now, you could take that 2 steps away and you could make apple juice. Again, has some nutrients in it, but it's a far cry from where you started with that whole food. And so I think a lot of the patterns we fall into in today's world is we're eating a lot of foods, especially our, quote, healthy foods. We're eating them in this state right here, away, few steps away from a whole food, and we think we're doing a really good job. I know a number of parents that will give their kids applesauce, and that counts toward their fruit or vegetable, with their dinner. And again, it's not a bad food choice, but they're not getting the nutritional benefits that they would if they cut up and sliced and had a real apple, or better yet, some broccoli or something green, something, with less sugar in it. And so a lot of what we eat, even in the health food realm, is kind of in this area right here. Now, something like McDonald's, I would put like way over on the wall over here, because I don't even think it's like on the same spectrum of, you can't even compare it to a whole food. My rule of thumb is if you can set it out on the counter and it doesn't change within about, 2 to 3 weeks, doesn't get moldy, or it's not a real food, and McDonald's, the French fry, you can find that in your car a year later and it looks the exact same as it did, and you could probably eat it and it would taste pretty similar. And so a lot of foods that we're eating they're just devoid of the nutrients. And so, if you can get 80% of your diet at a minimum from a whole food source, you're going to be doing great. And you find a lot of your whole foods around the perimeter of the grocery store. So that's where the produce is, that's where the meats are, that's where the nuts and seeds. A lot of grocery stores have gotten smart, and that's where they put their natural food sections. It's toward the edge of the grocery store. I mean, better yet, if you could grow it in your own backyard or find a farmer, that you could get the local produce from, that's even better, because, even the produce in the grocery store is, still being shipped in, and so it's not as nutrient rich as something you could grow yourself. You want to know the secret to having, knowing if your food is nutritious or not, is just go by the flavor of it. Like, has anybody ever had a garden and you grow tomatoes? If you grow tomatoes in the summer, you almost can't buy tomatoes at the grocery store anymore, because they just don't have any flavor. They just don't taste like tomatoes. And that's because the tomatoes you're growing, they ripen on the vine, and you've got all the nutrients, in the soil that, you just don't get at the grocery store. And so, a lot of our food today, even when you're eating the real food, doesn't have the nutrient content it did, 30 to 50 years ago. So, which is a whole nother conversation for another day. But if you can get 80 to 90% of your diet from a whole food source, that still leaves 10 to 20% that if you want to have, a little splurge here and there, go for it. Don't deprive yourself. But focus on that 80 to 90% rather than avoiding, foods. Focus on what you should be getting in your diet. And that switches the framework of how you make choices with your meals. Okay, so I apologize in advance. I always love to throw in a little bit of biochemistry, because I love to kind of show what we're thinking as practitioners behind the scenes. And so I'll break this down for you guys. But what you're looking at here is how the body utilizes something called omega-6 fatty acids versus omega-3 fatty acids. And these are in the body what are known as essential fatty acids. So these are fats that we have to get in our diet. Our body can't make these fats. And so we get a lot of omega-6 fatty acids from plant-based sources. Like a lot of your corn, sunflower, safflower, cottonseed. We get a lot of these in the oils. But these are high in omega-6 fatty acids. Versus your omega-3s tend to be higher, the highest sources in fish. So your fish oil, but certain, nuts and seeds like flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts, grass-fed, meat and eggs, hemp seeds, those are higher in omega-3s. And so when you look in the body, kind of how these are broken down, when you look at omega-6 fatty acids, which I have kind of circled here in red, doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, but I'll explain here in a second why they're in red. When you eat a lot of omega-6 fatty acids, those get broken down into pro-inflammatory mediators. So these are leukotrienes and prostaglandins that turn on inflammation. So these are pro-inflammatory, which again, like I mentioned in the beginning, it doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, because we need a little bit of inflammation. Versus your omega-3 fatty acids, when those get broken down into anti-inflammatory mediators. So in a perfect world, we would have equal amounts of omega-3s and omega-6s. And if we have equal amounts of those, we can turn on inflammation when we need it, and then turn it off when we don't need it anymore. But what's happening in today's world is we are getting way more omega-6 fatty acids than we are omega-3s. And so that is tipping the scales of, that anti versus pro-inflammatory. And the reason we're getting so many omega-6 fatty acids is if you look at all these oils, these are all of the cheap oils that are very shelf stable. So if you walk down the chip aisle at Dillon's and you start flipping bags over, not even necessarily just in the regular chip aisle, even in the natural food section, what you'll see is a lot of those chips are cooked in sunflower oil or safflower oil or cottonseed oil, and foods that are fried. When you get a lot of fried foods, they're fried in these vegetable oils because they're cheap. They're cheap and they're shelf stable. And so, and not only that, when we look at our cattle and our pigs, we're feeding them corn and we're feeding them these grains. And so when you look at the percentage of omega-6 versus omega-3 fatty acids in the meat that we're eating, we're getting a lot more omega-6 fatty acids, which my theory is, when you get diagnosed with heart disease, that's one of the first things the doctor tells you is stop eating red meat. Red meat is bad for you. Well, I'd love to see a study, and I don't know, Dustin, if you know of any studies that look at, is it truly the red meat that we're eating, or is it the fact that we're eating red meat that is much higher in omega-6 fatty acids, which is pro-inflammatory, and it's inflammation that is, at the root of a lot of heart disease. And so, that whole pathway, we are overstimulating this pathway with the amount of omega-6 fatty acids. And, and also when you eat meat, red meat, it's higher in arachidonic acid, which is this one right here, versus your fish oil has this EPA and DHA. This is why if you take, a fish oil supplement, it's not bad to take the plant-based ones, especially if you are vegan or vegetarian. Just know that they have to go through more steps to be broken down versus your fish oil. It's more of a direct shot into those anti-inflammatory mediators. So this is where we're getting the imbalance. And so I know, being a chiropractor, I have a number of patients that come to me and they're in pain and they're saying, well, I take a fish oil, why isn't it helping my pain? Well, you could be taking more omega-3 fatty acids, but if you're still getting a lot of omega-6 fatty acids in your diet, that balance could still be, out of whack a bit. And in fact, if you are a co-learner here at the Riordan Clinic, we measure omega-6 versus omega-3. So we measure all of these products, and I regularly see people that have a ratio of 40 to 1, 40 times the amount of omega-6s versus omega-3s. I mean, most people, I would say, run anywhere from about 15 to 30. That's about average, for, a ratio of omega-6 to 3s. But ideally, you want to get, as close to 1 to 1 as you can. And it's an essential fatty acids, EFAs. Yep, essential fatty acid test. Olive oil and coconut oil. That's a great question. So olive oil and coconut oil and avocados, those are higher in omega-9s, which those are going to be more anti-inflammatory. They're just not, on these pathways. One other thing. Oh, yeah. Yes.
If it's so important about the corn-fed versus grass-fed,
yes.
Chickens mostly eat grains, but you never see grass-fed chickens. So, but yet in poultry is pushed as a preference.
Yeah, poultry. I mean, poultry inherently is lower in fat, and so I would still recommend the organic grass-fed, if you can get it, just because when they're on a corn-fed diet, they tend to be more unhealthy, and they're pumped full of antibiotics, and so poultry tends to be more though on the lean side, anyways, and so you don't get a ton of fat when it comes to poultry, and so free range, grass-fed, yeah, you want to make sure too, it's not just grass-fed, but grass-finished. Because all cows start off grass-fed, but then they grain finish them, and it's that last, they put them on grains to fatten them up, which, as a side note, makes you wonder why we eat so many grains. but yeah, they put them on the corn and the grains to fatten them up at the end. So you want grass-fed, grass-finished meat. The best place is to find somebody locally. There are a lot of really great local farmers, and we have a list I can give you. We have a list of local farmers, and best way is just to kind of get a portion of a cow at a time. Yeah, or farmers markets, they have them. Green Acres has them. All the health food stores would. So, yeah. The distinctions about fish oil. So, fish oil is one of those you definitely want to go for a higher quality. You don't want to buy it at Walmart because there is a big difference. But a lot of it depends on your particular needs. So I would recommend testing because sometimes people need more EPA, sometimes they need more DHA. So it just kind of depends on what the individual needs are of the person. If you're in a state of inflammation, I mean, the dose makes a difference too. A lot of the kids I see, we regularly put them on a dose that's about 5 times the amount of what is in a normal child's fish oil supplement. So the dose does make a difference also. Yes.
What do you think about krill oil? How much does that make a difference?
Yeah, so the question was krill oil. Yeah, krill oil, it's a great source. That's a great source of omega-3s. And so I mean, definitely, a lot of it depends upon, what's not shown on this pathway. There are a lot of nutrients that are needed for these different steps. So, so a lot of it depends on, how well your body utilizes, it can break down, some of these different fish oils as to how well it can utilize them. So. One other kind of clinical side note that I'll mention, and this I find really, really powerful. When you look at, has anybody ever heard of an NSAID drug, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, like Advil, ibuprofen, all those NSAID drugs? The other name for them is they're also called COX inhibitors. And the reason they're called that is they inhibit this enzyme right here. It's called cyclooxygenase. So you'll see there's a cyclooxygenase on this side and there's a cyclooxygenase on this side. So when you take that Advil, you're essentially knocking out that enzyme right there, which is great because it decreases the amount of pro-inflammatory mediators that are made. Now, long-term use, you're also, with some of them knocking out this enzyme right here, so you have to be careful with long-term use. But to me, this is such a powerful example of, okay, yes, you could take a drug, or you could decrease the amount of omega-6s in your diet and increase the amount of omega-3s and have the exact same effect. And you're not, having to, have any of the side effects of taking a medication like that. And so that's the power of food. When we say food is medicine, that's the power of it right there is that, that's one example, of how you can replace the drugs you're on with the food that you're eating. Yes?
Can you have too much omega-3, such as I often throughout the week eat a lot of salmon.
Yeah.
But I also supplement with
Yeah.
omega-3.
Yeah.
Is that overkill?
Yeah, so the question for anybody online is, can you get too much omega-3s? And hypothetically, yes, you can. And a lot of times what you tend to see with that is maybe a little bit of a blood thinning effect. I did have one patient who was on, she put herself on, it was 8,000 to 9,000 milligrams of fish oil. And she came to me and she's like, I'm getting these nosebleeds and they go for 30 minutes and they won't stop. And it's when she's also on turmeric. And so she was maybe doing a little bit overkill. So you can get too much. It's not common. I don't think I've ever seen labs come back where the ratio is skewed in the wrong way.
And so you get a cut and you don't
stop bleeding. Yeah, I mean, it could be other things too, but I do start to question it, depending on what dosage of fish oil, but you have to get pretty high. I mean, most people, don't do much. I mean, a high dose of fish oil is 3,000, and like I said, she was on 8,000. So she was on a really high dose, which was great. She had no arthritis pain, which is why she was taking it, but you can theoretically get too much. I just rarely see people get too much. So I don't think, you need to worry about that. Any other questions about this? Okay. One thing I will mention too, because it'll come up here in a little bit, you can take some of these omega-6s and, there are some side pathways that are anti-inflammatory, so, one other thing that's really important too, when you look at whole foods, going back to our rule number 1, eat 80% of your diet from whole foods. Most whole foods, even, nuts and seeds, a lot of them have both omega-3s and omega-6s in them. And a lot of foods have a pretty equal ratio. Some are skewed more in one direction versus the other. But if you go back to eating an 80% whole foods diet, this is going to naturally start to balance out. It just is, because number one, you're not going to be getting as many omega-6 fatty acids, because these are real high in all the processed foods. And two, you're going to be getting more of a balance. And so, there is, some conversation about don't eat as many almonds because they're higher in omega-6s, which, again, yes, if you're eating almonds all day long, every day, you could theoretically skew that a bit. But I would say, if you're going to eat a whole food, eat something like almonds versus going for the potato chips, because you're going to be way better off, with the almonds than you would, the potato chips. And so in nature, if you go back to rule number one, you'll naturally start to balance this out. All right, so our third thing, this is the third thing that connects diet with inflammation. And this is looking at what's called the glycemic index, which is essentially looking at the effect of food on our blood sugar. Because, a lot of times, when we eat foods, especially foods that are high in sugar, what happens is, again, a lot of the sugars get broken down very easily, in the digestive tract. So they're absorbed very, very quickly. So when you eat a high amount of sugar that's broken down and absorbed very quickly, what happens is that sugar very quickly gets into the bloodstream. So foods that are high in sugar are going to have a high glycemic index value. And so when you eat those foods, what happens is that sugar very quickly starts to build up in the bloodstream. And the body senses that. And so when the body senses sugar building up in the blood, it releases a lot of, does anybody know the hormone? Insulin, exactly. Releases a lot of insulin. And so, when you look at this curve right here, this is about where insulin's starting to kick in. And the body, to compensate for this sharp increase in sugar, the body probably dumped a lot of insulin, so that insulin very quickly started to take that sugar from the bloodstream and put it in our cells. Put it in our muscle cells, our liver cells, our skin cells. Our cells can't get sugar without insulin. And so, this is the point where insulin kicks in, starts pulling it out of the bloodstream, and so you see this quick drop. And then sometimes you even see it drop a little bit too far, and this is what we call hypoglycemia. This is where your sugar actually goes too low. This is what we call hangry. If you start getting hungry and you get irritable and you get shaky or you get lightheaded, that's when your blood sugar is getting too low. And so when you eat a high sugar or even a high carbohydrate, high glycemic sort of meal, this is the pattern you see with your blood sugar. Versus if you eat a low glycemic food, which is going to be something that's high in fiber, high in fat, or high in protein, those get broken down a lot more slowly. And so what you see is kind of this slow release of sugar into the bloodstream, kind of this slow release of insulin and this slow kind of pulling that sugar out of the bloodstream. And so, this sort of a pattern, you're going to get to lunchtime, and rather than being ravenous and starving, it's going to become lunchtime and you're like, I can eat, I'm hungry, it's time to eat, rather than that, give me whatever's in front of me sort of low glycemic state that, we tend to be in. And so, so you could have, like, if this is breakfast right here, if you have a breakfast of Dunkin' Donuts and coffee, that's going to shoot your blood sugar up, and then you're going to drop, and, 2 hours later, you're going to be hungry again. You're going to be looking for something else to eat. You could eat the exact same number of calories, but you eat those calories as maybe some scrambled eggs and spinach and an avocado, and that sort of a meal will satisfy you all the way until lunchtime. And so because we live in a world where everything has added sugar, and if you don't believe me, go back. I gave a lecture last week on sugar. Go back, and it's on our YouTube channel. Go back and watch it, because everything we eat, whether you realize it or not, has added sugar. So start looking at labels, peanut butter, pickles, tomato sauce, everything, yogurt. Yogurt is one of the worst as far as added sugar. And so we're getting high amounts of sugar. And so what's happening is we're on this roller coaster ride all day long, where we eat breakfast, we get hungry, so we have crackers. Crackers are a simple carb, so our blood sugar shoots back up, and then and then it drops, and then we're hungry again. And so when you get in that sort of a pattern, that sets you up not only to consume more calories, but it also, can, create more of an inflammatory state in the body. One thing, I'll also mention, when your blood sugar drops like this, when you go hypoglycemic, one of the hormones that the body releases to help compensate for that hypoglycemic state is cortisol. And so if you've ever been told you have an adrenal issue, start with your diet. Start with regulating your blood sugar, because regulating your blood sugar can also help balance out some of your adrenal problems. And this sort of a pattern, this high versus low glycemic, even though there's kind of an official index, I always encourage people to be aware of how you individually respond to foods. Because for someone like me, I've got a family history of diabetes, a very strong family history on my dad's side. And so for me, if I had a breakfast of, say, oatmeal and a banana, even though that's what, your heart doctor will tell you, that's a great breakfast, oatmeal's great for the heart, that is way too many carbs for me. And that right there will shoot me up into a high glycemic state, because my insulin doesn't work as well as other people. And if I had a meal like that, come 10 o'clock, I'm hungry again, And so use the cues of your body to figure out, if you eat something for breakfast and you're hungry a few hours later, that probably isn't something that's going to sustain you. And so play around with increasing the amount of protein, increasing the amount of fat. It's different for everybody as far as try fasting. If you do that intermittent fasting, that can help stabilize your blood sugar to where, when I go through periods where I do the fasting, come lunchtime, I'm really not terribly hungry, and the rest of the day, I can keep my blood sugar more stable. So play around with what works for you, because there isn't kind of a one-size-fits-all for everyone. And if you wanted to get really technical, some of my patients, I'll actually have them get a glucometer to see, test their blood sugar after eating certain foods to see which ones spike. Because for some people, they can get away with having some rice, but for others, that's too high glycemic for them, and that shoots them into this high glycemic roller coaster sort of state. So be aware of what works for you individually, because everyone's a little bit different. So our high glycemic foods, these are foods that are going to be high glycemic for pretty much anybody. And it's basically anything that tastes good, you can pretty well guarantee it's high glycemic. Exactly, and again, it's, so like your white sugar, your white flour, white potatoes, juices, having a lot of juices can be high glycemic. And, again, not that we can't ever have these foods, but, one thing to, maybe be aware of is if you're going to have something, if you're going to have some white potatoes, maybe you only have half the amount that you normally would, and make sure you're having enough protein and enough fat with it, so it's not just potatoes by itself, that you can add, something that will help kind of balance out some of that increase in the glycemic load. Some of the low glycemic foods, of course, I said anything that's high in fiber, anything that's high in fats, and anything that's high in protein are going to be more low glycemic, which these foods do taste really good to us. Fats are another really good source of energy, which is why we like fats. You just can't do both at the same time and maintain, if you do fats with sugar, your body's going to burn the sugar and store the fat. So, so try and, we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but just as a whole, sticking as low glycemic and getting, even fruits, even though fruits have sugar in them, fruits also have fiber, so fiber is going to slow down the release of that sugar. So it's not going to be a spike. It's going to be a little bit more of a rolling curve. So like I said, I mentioned a few of these. Some of the consequences of a high glycemic diet is that adrenal exhaustion, when you're up and down in your blood sugar, that can create some adrenal fatigue. This is the connection with inflammation. High insulin activates an enzyme called delta-5 desaturase. So I'm going to sneak back here. You thought I was done, but I'm not with the biochemistry. Delta-5 desaturase is right here, this enzyme right here. So the higher your insulin levels are, the more sugar you're having, the more you're going to be promoting this pro-inflammatory pathway. So, so you want to, that's one connection with sugar and inflammation. And then I've also found one other consequence is the more we tend to have high glycemic foods, these tend to be foods that just aren't as rich in nutrients. If you have, white flour, it's so devoid of nutrients that they have to fortify it, with nutrients. Anything that's fortified, don't trust, because number one, they're fortifying it with the wrong types of nutrients. And then number two, when you can get, foods that naturally have the right nutritional profile, why not just eat those? And those are going to be your whole foods. And as a whole foods are going to be lower glycemic most of the time. And so, a lot of times I'll encourage patients to go off of, processed grains, go off of sugars, flour, maybe not necessarily because they're celiac or they have, a gut issue, but just because when you take away white flour and you take away grains, you naturally are going to make better food choices. You're going to choose vegetables and you're going to choose proteins and fats. And so, clearing all of those high glycemic foods out of your diet, you'll naturally get more nutrients in the foods that you're eating. Which is a good segue into our last connection. This is the last connection between diet, not the only last, but the last one we'll talk about, of the connection between diet and inflammation. And this is something we call the ORAC score, which you don't really need to remember. All that really means is we're looking at how much color does food have. Because, another little trick you can use, if you're looking at your plate, your dinner plate at night, and you've got 80 to 90% whole foods, and you've got a variety of colors, that's a very nutritious meal, because the more colors you get, the more variety of nutrients you're going to have. And so, a lot of the foods that are higher on this ORAC score are going to be foods that have a deeper, richer color. And same thing with the berries. These are real high, as far as an ORAC score goes. And I always use the rule of thumb, if you're chopping up vegetables and it stains your fingers or it stains your cutting board, that's a really good, high ORAC score. Or I have a little 11-month-old, and anytime, he's covered, and he's orange or blue, I'm like, that was a good meal. And so that richness of colors, that's where all the nutritional value lies with our foods. And for anybody who got a booklet, I'll point out real fast, one really easy way to have a high ORAC sort of meal is to do smoothies. And so the very last page of your booklet is how to build a color smoothie. And if you didn't get a booklet, we have this handout for free upstairs. So as you're leaving, you can grab this handout and put it up on your refrigerator. But color smoothies are a great way. And this isn't the type of smoothie you get at Smoothie King. Smoothie King, it's usually just fruit and juice, and it's very high in sugar. This sort of a smoothie, you're going to have something green in it, lots of berries, whole foods. The key to a smoothie is also adding in boosters. Boosters are what we call, like stuff like nuts and seeds, flax seeds, coconut oil, MCT oil. These are the things that are going to give your smoothie weight, so that you can use it as a meal replacement or as a nice snack in the afternoon. But use this guide to kind of make a smoothie, because especially during the summertime, this is a great breakfast. We have a blender here at work, and we'll all bring our little baggies of fruits and stuff and make smoothies for lunch. And it's a really, really great way to get 100% whole foods meal. This is all whole foods in a nice, neat package, and play around with. There's a lot of fun things. One of my favorite things, I like to do this in the fall, is to take canned pumpkin, take organic canned pumpkin, and I'll mix it with some ice cubes, almond milk, and then I'll throw in some pumpkin pie spice and some cinnamon, and you can make, a smoothie that is better than a Starbucks pumpkin spice latte, and a whole lot healthier for you too. So play around with some of those things. And if you go online, there are tons and tons of recipes for any different type of smoothie you can imagine. And it's a great, great whole foods meal. And as much as you can, pick these high ORAC score foods. And just as a side note too, I hesitate to comment because I don't know a whole lot about them, but essential oils, if anybody does essential oils, those are real high ORAC substances. And so, again, I would defer to anybody who's more of an expert in that than I am. And so we do essential oil classes if anybody's interested in learning more, but those are extracted from plants, and so you're getting that high, nutritional value that you get from a lot of these foods. All right, so those are the 4 things that connect the diet with inflammation. It's whole foods, it's your essential fatty acids, it's just sugar in your food, and it's also the color in your food. So those are our 4 things that we're going to look at. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through those 4 major dietary shifts, and we're going to look at how those factors changed. Because as you'll see, as we go along and we get more and more processed in the way we eat, those factors start to change pretty radically. And so the place we'll start is with the ancestral diet. And this is a really, really loose general term, because ancestral, depending on where people lived, if they were closer to the equator versus further north, their diet probably looked pretty different. But these people ate, all whole foods because they didn't have any other choice. But when they look at these kind of what we call hunter-gatherer sorts of cultures, what they find is that these people rarely experience degenerative and inflammatory disease. Now, one thing, one kind of rebuttal to that I've heard is people are like, well, they probably didn't live much beyond the age of, 30 to 35, so they probably didn't live long enough to really get into some of that expression. And I would agree with that in some sense, but the flip side to that is, like I mentioned at the beginning, the only thing that changes as we age is we just don't heal as quickly as we did when we're young. And so, today, like I said, I see a lot of kids that have high inflammatory markers, and whether they don't necessarily always feel the effects of those markers because they're rapidly healing. And so, I think the other thing too is that, like I said, it's not inevitable that as we age, we have to, get these inflammatory related diseases. A lot of it depends on what you're doing with your lifestyle. You do have to work harder the older you get to maintain low levels of inflammation, but it is possible to maintain a healthy inflammatory state. Now, I do a little side note here, because when you look at the ancestral diet, this is something I think that surprises a lot of people. When you look at the ancestral diet and what made up their diet, about 19 to 35% of their diet came from protein. The biggest amount of their calories actually came from fat. Again, they had a nice 1-to-1 ratio. But carbohydrates were a more negligible amount of their diet. And the reason I point this out is, this is another example of how, our biochemistry has gone awry in the world we live in today. Because when you look at how we burn energy, you can think of our bodies as kind of having two engines to burn fuel. We've got one engine that burns sugar for fuel, and we've got one engine that burns fat for fuel. And if we are, eating a balanced diet and we're eating both carbohydrates and fats, the body is always going to burn sugar and carbohydrates first. This engine is always going to be preferential. And so, but when you deplete the body of sugars, the body switches over into this fat burning mode, which a lot of us do, at nighttime. That's how we can go for 10 hours sleeping at night without starving to death, because we switch into burning fats. But for our ancestors, since most of their calories came from fat, they primarily existed in that fat-burning engine, mode for fuel. Versus today, we get way more carbohydrates. So we're always kind of burning on that carbohydrate engine, which I think is another reason why we have a hard time, losing weight. Because, with the carbohydrate engine, when you run out of fuel, that's that low glycemic. The body needs more carbohydrates. Versus if you're using your fat-burning engine and you run out of fuel, you can start pulling stored fat, pretty seamlessly and start burning that for energy. And so, this is another reason why, what you have for breakfast is really, really important, because if you switch overnight into that kind of fat-burning mode, in the morning, if you maintain a low carbohydrate, higher fat, higher protein breakfast, you're going to be feeding that fat-burning engine, throughout the morning and throughout the early afternoon. And so you're going to stay in that fat-burning mode. Same thing if you fast. If you have that intermittent fasting in the morning, you're going to stay in that fat-burning mode, and it'll help kind of lean you out a little bit. Versus if the first thing you have for breakfast is carbohydrates, the body's going to immediately start burning that for energy, and then it's going to run out, and you're going to eat more carbohydrates, and it's hard to get switch back, throughout the day. So, and again, this is a throwback to how our ancestors ate. Since a higher percentage of their diet was from fat, then, that was, it's historically maybe a little bit of a better source of fuel for us, over the long term. And so what's interesting is this, is all in the media now. There are a number of famous authors that have written books about fat for fuel. Mercola just released one. There's one called Headstrong by Dave Asprey. There's a lot of, when we started this class 2 years ago, it wasn't as much of a conversation, and I felt like I was trying to convince people more to eat fat, that it's not going to make you fat. But I feel like that's becoming more and more well accepted, that we understand that fat is a great source of energy, and that we can eat it without getting fat.
Dr. Ann,
yes?
what about for the rare person who doesn't have a lot of, who has a real lean body mass and doesn't have a lot of stored fat?
Yeah.
Is there such a thing, or is that just a misconception?
the question was the person who has a more lean body type, and there are people that do just have a more kind of lean body type, and that's where there isn't kind of a one size fits all for everybody, and that's why I encourage people to play around with what they're eating. But a lot of the first step to any of that is getting back to eating whole foods, because if you're eating processed foods, it's hard to cue hunger, and it's hard to really get a good gauge of how your body processes that energy, because it's not really processing a lot of the whole foods, and it doesn't maybe necessarily have all the nutrients that you need. And so, again, when we're younger, we're in such a repair mode, burning mode, that, again, kids can get away with eating just about, and most kids can. Now, again, the rate of obesity is sharply rising in the pediatric population also. So we're seeing, that isn't always necessarily the case, but yeah, it's finding what works, because some people do really, really well on a high-fat, low-carb diet, but I wouldn't recommend staying on that forever. You need to cycle through, you need to get some carbohydrates in and kind of figure out what your right balance is, and it's different for everybody. So I know that doesn't help, and that's always hard, but I always encourage people to kind of get more in touch with how you feel when you eat certain things. And again, you can't do that until you're eating real foods. And once you're eating real foods, you can kind of start to see, like for me, I don't do well with a really high-fat breakfast. I feel more lethargic. My body just doesn't process that quickly for fuel. I do better fasting, but some people don't do well fasting, and they do better with the fats. So it's just kind of figuring out what works for you, where you're in a state where you have energy, you feel well, you're at a healthy weight, and that's where you've kind of hit your balance. So yes.
What's your personal opinion on Dave Asprey? Do you believe in his bulletproof coffee?
So the question was my personal opinion on Dave Asprey. I think he's great. I mean, I think I love his perspective, because he's not a practitioner. He kind of comes at things from a different perspective. Even he will say that you don't want to do his thing forever. That you don't want to be in a state of ketosis, which is where you're eating fats. That's where your body is making ketones, which you burn for energy in place of sugar. He will even say you don't want to be in ketosis, for long periods of time, that you need to cycle in, some of those carbohydrates. And so, I think, yes, it absolutely makes sense, and for some people, I think it's a really, really great tool. For others, it may not, depending on some of your genetic makeup, you may not do well. Like I have a gene called an ApoE gene, which is one of the kind of an old gene, and makes me at higher risk for heart disease. And so, when I was going through my genetic, with a counselor, she was like, yeah, it makes sense why you wouldn't do well with just a high fat meal. You've got to have protein with it. Your body just doesn't process that fat well for fuel. So that's me, though. Somebody else could be completely different. So I encourage people, try it, see how you feel on it, and if you feel great, then it's something to consider. So, but that's also why I think, doing blood testing is important too, because you want to monitor your blood work too and see not only how do you feel, but also how is it affecting your biochemistry. And so.
And he does. I think he does a lot.
Yeah. So. Okay, so when we look at the ancestral diet, this is, according to our 4 factors, this is how the ancestral diet stacks up. So 100% whole foods, that's all they had available. They had a 1-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to 3 fatty acids. Glycemic index is very low because they're eating a lot of lean meats and fish and fats. ORAC score is very high because they're getting a lot of color, a lot of vegetable matter. So this essentially is what our body was designed to use for fuel. And this is what our digestive system was designed to process and break down for fuel. So now let's see what starts to happen when we start to change things a little bit. Because in the ancestral state, things were kind of in a state of balance. So agricultural revolution. Again, this isn't a very well-defined, this isn't like, certain years, that we're talking about. But this as a whole, when you start talking about the agricultural revolution, you start talking about more of the increased dependence upon grains. The more, people start, feeding grains to their cattle, the more grains, start to be more of a staple in the diet versus, being kind of an addition. And so when you look at grains, it's the advantage to us as a society is, you could be less nomadic. You could stay in one place, which was an advantage to us. But as you can see, it starts to shift us just a little bit into a pro-inflammatory state. And one thing I'll mention too, grains during this period are like true whole grains. I mean, this is very, very different even than the grains that we see today, because the grains we see today are highly refined, highly processed, don't have much nutritional value to them. So this is even still when grains have nutritional value to them, and they are, more of a whole food. So during this period, agricultural revolution, slight decrease in the amount of whole foods. This is probably the biggest change, slight shift more 5-to-1, from omega-6 to 3 ratio, which today if I see a 5-to-1 ratio, I'm ecstatic because that's just an amazing, amazingly low ratio. Glycemic index isn't as great, because grains are higher on the glycemic index. ORAC score isn't as great because, again, if you start to replace some vegetable matter with grains, you're not getting as many of the colorful foods. So all in all, during this time period, just maybe a slight shift, in these inflammatory markers. Where we start to see the biggest change is what we call the Industrial Revolution diet. And again, not a well-defined time period, but how I define this is the time period where food became a business. This is where, you started getting bigger companies that were involved, and the decisions that they were making about food wasn't so much about just, being able to provide, nutritional value for food, for people, but it was about how do we make foods last longer on the shelf, how do we make them taste better so that people will buy more of them, and how do we make them less expensive. So all of those factors, when those started coming into the decision-making process, that combined with the fact that people, didn't have home gardens and they weren't living on farms anymore, they were relying more and more on buying their food, that all contributed to some of these methods we see of processing the food. So you start seeing the separation of fats, so that's, when you make a trans fat, that's you're heating that oil and breaking some of the bonds, and it turns it into a different shape of that fat molecule. Making stuff like margarine. You start refining grains and refining sugar, where you refine out all of the things that make it really healthy, and but those are also the things that make it go bad more quickly on the shelf. So you would take those things out, they last longer on the shelf, they taste better. It's a win-win for everybody except for those who are eating the grains. Refining the sugar, you're replacing, nutrient-dense foods with these refined foods, and we start to see more of a strong shift into a pro-inflammatory state. Again, what I don't mean to diminish when we go through this stuff is, this time period, like I kind of think about this as like post-World War I, post-World War II. And when I talk to my grandma, who's in her late 80s, she grew up on a farm in Kansas. And I remember this distinct conversation she and I had where, my husband and I had a big garden, and I was telling her, I was like, Grandma, we're going to can the tomatoes and make tomato sauce and pickles. And she just looked at me totally confused, and she's like, she calls me Annie. She's like, Annie, she's like, you realize you can buy canned tomatoes from the grocery store for 99 cents. And I was like, well, yeah, Grandma, I know. But it's like, these are, homegrown, and these are healthy. And for her, in her mind, that was such a radical shift. When you didn't have to do everything, by yourself, it's like when you could go to the store, that convenience factor was huge. And especially, I think, for women, it was huge because it allowed them not to be, so consumed with all of the duties of the home, and it allowed them to kind of think outside of that. And so, so there was, again, as a society, an advantage of moving in this direction. I just don't think at the time anybody was thinking about, well, what is this doing to our health, and how is this shifting, the nutrients that we're getting in our bodies. And it's interesting because, during this time period, what we see is a much higher increase in glycemic index and sugar, and, that dysregulation of sugar, we see in this generation, my grandma's generation, a high incidence of dementia, Alzheimer's, and they call some of those diseases type 3 diabetes because it's very closely linked to blood sugar dysregulation in the body, which makes me terrified because, at least my grandma grew up on a farm where, for the first 20 to 25 years of her life, she had a farm diet that was rich in whole foods and omega-3s. And, my kids are growing up in a world where, the average child is consuming 46 pounds of sugar a year. I mean, their body weight in sugar, so it's a little bit terrifying, I think, for generations to come. But when you look at this time period, whole foods were down to 65%. And this number is still higher than it is today because a lot of people were still eating at home. There's much more of that compared to today. This is a big shift. 6-to-3 ratio is now 10-to-1. Much more of a shift into the pro-inflammatory state. Glycemic index is high, because again, eating a lot of processed, refined grains and sugars. ORAC score is low because we're replacing a lot of vegetables. So this is where things really start to get out of balance. So that's where until we get to today. Today we're kind of in this convenience fast food revolution where, again, we're eating a lot of these processed foods. We're becoming more reliant on them. We go through drive-thrus a lot. We're eating on the run. Probably one of the things that's crept into our food here within the past 20 to 30 years are all of the additives and preservatives. They figured out that they can put some chemicals in our food that make them last a lot longer on the shelf, which is great for big business, bad for us. One of the, do I have it on here? Oh yeah, one of the things I love to talk to people about are these natural and artificial flavorings. That's something that if you turn over almost any processed food box, you will see either natural or artificial flavorings on the label, which natural in this case doesn't mean anything different than artificial. But these flavorings, they've started adding to foods. They started developing these back in the 70s, and what they figured out how to do is to chemically replicate flavor, which a great example of this is if you look at vanilla extract versus imitation vanilla. Vanilla extract, there's some medicinal properties to vanilla extract, and when you chemically replicate that flavor, you can make that imitation vanilla, which probably can't taste the difference if you put it in cookies or anything like that. But that imitation vanilla is still triggering in the brain that flavor of vanilla, yet there's no nutritional value attached to that food whatsoever. And this, I think, is a really, really dangerous place to be because, when we're consuming all these processed foods, our brain is programmed to think flavor equals nutrition. That's why, an organic apple tastes better than a regular apple because it's got more nutritional value. And so if we're eating all these foods that have been sprayed with these artificial flavorings, not only are you bombarding the brain with these artificial flavorings, that real food is never going to match up and never going to have that much flavor, but you're also tricking the brain into thinking it's getting something that it's not. So when you have that Pringles chip that's the sour cream flavor, you eat, a serving of them and your body's like doesn't get anything nutritional out of them. They're like, well, maybe I need more. So you eat more and then you end up eating the whole can of them, and so, this is probably one of the things I tell people when you're wanting to switch to a healthy diet, this is the first thing to cut out. You've got to cut out all the artificial flavorings because until you cut those out, real food is never going to taste good. You're never going to be able to kind of intuitively figure out what it is you need to be eating because I've had a number of patients that have gone through this process and they cut out artificial flavorings and then all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, like I crave Brussels sprouts, all the time, and it's like, or I crave sweet potatoes all the time, and it's kind of like there's probably something nutritionally they need in those foods that they never would have been able to identify if they're constantly bombarding, them with flavors. And this, too, with kids. This is another thing I tell parents. With kids, if they're eating all those flavor-blasted goldfish and, all those, broccoli's not going to taste good, because that's the level of intensity they're used to. But if you start cutting those things out, kids will get more adventurous and they will try foods. And, that doesn't mean you have to eat bland foods, but flavor your foods with real spices, and real herbs and use real fats and real sea salt, stuff that actually has some medicinal value. Use those things to flavor your food. And not only are you going to get more satisfaction out of that, but it's also, in the long run, it's going to end up tasting better. So that's where we're at today. A lot of these processed chemicals, and all these processed foods that we're eating. So this is where we're at. Whole foods, 35%, which honestly, I even think that number is a stretch. With the number of food diaries I see, I don't think a lot of people are even getting 35% whole foods. They're maybe getting 35% of applesauce and, maybe a few things that are a few steps away from a whole food, but I think that number is a stretch. Omega-6 to 3 ratio, 20 to 1. Again, 20 to 1 is probably at the lower end. I see a lot more people who are closer to 30, 40, 50, 60 to 1. So a lot of people that ratio's off. Glycemic index is very high. Again, go watch the sugar lecture I gave. Most people are way, way, way over consuming sugar. And if you aren't actively trying to keep sugar out of your diet, it is in your diet in a very big way. Just start looking at the labels of what you're eating. ORAC score is very low, so this is, again, we're not eating the fruits and vegetables in the color that we used to eat. So this is where we're at today. We are 20 times more inflamed, and all these things that help protect us, and modulate that inflammation, we're getting less and less of. And so that is, this is where what we are eating really can have a tremendous impact on the inflammation levels in our body. And depending on where you're at, in the progression of disease that you're dealing with, diet is the best place to start. Sometimes it's not the only answer, but it's always the best place to start, because it's like if you're in a canoe and you've got a hole and you've got water coming in, we can give you supplements, which is like handing you a bucket, and you can start flushing that water out, and you might keep yourself from sinking, but until you plug that hole, you're going to be working a lot harder than you need to help keep yourself afloat. You're much better off just plugging that hole, and diet is the best place to start with that. Are there any questions about that? Yeah. Uh-huh.
That you also mean the natural and artificial sweeteners too?
Yeah, so those are a little. So the question is, what about natural and artificial sweeteners? And so those are a little bit different. Like if you look on a label, you could see they have to like artificial flavorings. And so versus aspartame, sucralose, which are artificial sweeteners, same idea. Those are creating a heightened sense of sweetness. That doesn't have any calories attached to it. And so, those also have chemically their own issues as far as they're neurotoxic, they kill your gut flora, so they're just I wouldn't even go there with any of those. I would just avoid those as much as possible. And some of the more natural ones like stevia, and xylitol are better, and if you need a little bit of sweet, those are leaps and bounds, much better choice beyond the other ones. But the best goal is to get yourself to the place where you don't feel like you need sugar all the time, and you don't need that constant taste of sweet all the time. And so slowly kind of, working your way off of even those is a good thing too.
Because they will raise your glycemic.
They still trigger, even that taste of sweet on the tongue will still trigger an insulin response. And so that's why I recommend, again, just cutting back on them and not, because some people I know they'll cut sugar, but then they'll drink, those Zevias that have this, or they'll make a bunch of stuff with the stevia. And again, there's always, I say there's a good, a better, and a best choice, and it's a really good choice to choose stevia over, Splenda, but a much better choice is to try and just decrease that dependence on sweets altogether, which takes time. And so, yeah, exactly. That's where, I understand everybody comes in at a different place. And so, it's just finding, kind of working your way baby steps in the right direction. And you'll get there. The more you balance out your blood sugar, the more you'll find you don't crave sugar and you don't crave sweets and you don't need it as much. And so, you'll get there. It just takes a little bit of time. And in the meantime, definitely do stevia over sugar or aspartame. So, yes.
Well, I've tried a perfect diet for like 2 months, and I felt like when I got to where I wanted to be, that I was almost reliant on fruits.
Yeah.
Because of the sugars. Do you think that's just my body needing it?
Possibly, yeah.
Or just almost too much? Because I do juicing and whatnot.
Yeah. So the question was, he feels for the past couple of months has been doing a really strict, good diet, and still felt like you were reliant on sugars. And in that regard, you kind of have to look at your own individual profile as far as, is there candida involved? Candida causes a craving for sweetness. Is there, do you have, more of an insulin-resistant sort of, biochemistry? And so, so any little bit of sugar is going to create that roller coaster. It's going to affect your blood sugar, which creates more of a craving for those things. And so you kind of have to look individually. And then part of it, too, is maybe your constitution, you just need more carbohydrates than what you were giving yourself. And so focusing more on the complex carbohydrates like sweet potatoes, maybe a little bit of brown rice or quinoa or something, might help calm that craving down a little bit. So it's kind of figuring out what works for you. So do you have one more question? Yeah.
Thoughts on the Whole30 diet?
Yeah, so the question was thoughts on the Whole30 diet. I think it's great. I think it's a wonderful, because that's whole foods. That the whole point of that diet is to eat 100% whole foods. And so, yeah, I think it's great. And I think they emphasize, just the quality of the food that you're eating, that, because there are some low carb diets that don't necessarily, it's just low carb, not necessarily quality. And so you want to make sure that you're getting good grass-fed meat, which is, again, it's more expensive, but I kind of find that balances out the fact that, we don't need to have it every meal every day, that, it kind of naturally decreases the amount of, meat that we're having. And so, which naturally puts you more into a dependence on vegetables, which is a good thing. So yeah, so the Whole30 diet I think is great. And I regularly will encourage patients to try Whole30, paleo, autoimmune paleo, candida diet, just depending on their individual needs. And, and encourage people to think of the Whole30 as a lifestyle change, not just a diet, a 30-day diet, but how can you make that lifestyle jump? So, yeah. Yeah.
My husband is just diagnosed as insulin resistant.
Yeah.
And he has an appointment today, but the doctor had already prescribed a medication for him.
Yeah.
He hasn't picked it up, and is that something that he could possibly reverse with diet and exercise?
Yeah. So the question was, can you reverse insulin resistance? And again, depending on how that's defined and what his blood sugars look like, absolutely. Yeah, that very regularly, you can start to at least reverse and manage. And there are certain supplements you can use in place of, if it was, say, metformin, you can use something called berberine, which has been shown to be just as effective as metformin, So there are a lot of different things you can definitely manage. It's called berberine. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's such a great question. The question was, how does malabsorption affect it? And that was the great, plant question to go on to the next, because the next section is all about leaky gut. So that was perfect. Thank you. So real fast, before we jump into leaky gut, I kind of wrote down, 14 strategies for leading kind of an anti-inflammatory lifestyle or diet. And pick one or two of these to start with and kind of work your way through the list. But if you want to get more into an anti-inflammatory state, these are the strategies. So number one, eat, whole foods. That's, again, my rule number one, 80 to 90%, at least 100% if you can do it. Eat more fish, so especially cold water, wild caught. Don't do the farm raised stuff because it's junk. Eat grass-fed lean meats, especially if you can find some locally. Eat lots of colorful vegetables, eat your colors. Use spices and herbs. I just kind of alluded to this. If you want to flavor your food, especially summertime, grow a little herb garden and cut some fresh basil, cut some fresh chives. And I'm telling you, that's the secret to gourmet food right there, is it's the fresh ingredients and it's the use of these different spices and herbs. And so real easy strategies to not only elevate the flavor of your food, but also the nutritional value. For your oils, use olive oil or coconut oil. And actually with olive oil, I don't recommend doing high heat cooking, because olive oil is actually pretty heat sensitive. And so if you heat it, if you fry with olive oil or you roast with it, it actually turns into a trans fat. So you want to stick with coconut oil, avocado oil. If you can get grass-fed butter is also, any of the oils that are solid at room temperature are going to be more heat stable. So, but olive oil is great for drizzling on or just kind of for low sauteing. Avoid your food sensitivities or allergens. You know, we do what's called a cytotoxic food test. But these foods, if you're eating certain foods that are triggering inflammation, they could be really healthy foods for most people, like tomatoes, but for some people that triggers, you know, arthritis or inflammation. So you want to, you know, just be aware of your food sensitivities and allergies. Avoid the conventional vegetable oils. Again, use in any recipe, if it calls for vegetable oil, you can use coconut oil. 1 for 1, exactly replace it. Limit your intake of refined sugars. Avoid is better, you know, especially high fructose corn syrup. Avoid or limit your refined grains. Limit dairy. You know, dairy is one of those things that, you know, a lot of doctors in this alternative space will say no dairy, which I say it depends on the person. Use it as a garnish and as a condiment, not as your main course. You know, so if you do process dairy, okay, number one, make sure it's organic. Absolutely, absolutely make sure it's organic. 80% of antibiotics used in this country are used on livestock. So that's a really high passive source of antibiotics. So make sure it's organic and just do little bits of it as a garnish if you can process it well. Definitely no cow's milk. Cow's milk is junk. And again, I see a lot of kids, and it's this radical idea when I tell moms, they're like, well, what do I put my kids on when they turn 1? It's like, water. Like, well, what about calcium? And I'm like, well, what about magnesium and zinc? And, you know, all these other, you know, kids will get, if they're eating vegetables, they'll get plenty of calcium. So don't worry about, you know, getting calcium from milk. You know, we get really concerned about that. But you'll get those from vegetables if your kids are eating a high vegetable diet. Snack on nuts and seeds. Those are great low glycemic, you know, good omega-3 rich foods. When you're thirsty, drink water. You know, drinks are a really big hidden source of sugar. So if you do apple juice in the morning or orange juice in the morning, those have a lot of sugar in them. If you do a Starbucks drink every other day, that's got a lot of sugar in it. If you do Gatorade after you exercise, it's got a lot of sugar in it. You know, so of course everybody knows if you do soda or pop, that's got a lot of sugar in it. So really be aware of what you're drinking, and you can cut out a lot of sugar that way just by drinking water. And then number 14, eat organic as much as possible. And you know, when you talk about kind of why we eat organic, you know, again, you can look at, you know, the food industry and the seed companies have you know, revolutionized, you know, the types of seeds that we grow, and they now have what are called Roundup Ready seeds. You know, so this is like Roundup Ready corn or Roundup Ready wheat, and these are seeds that grow plants that are naturally resistant to the herbicide Roundup. So farmers can spray Roundup all over their crops, and it doesn't affect the plants, but it kills the weeds. And so, so we're getting high amounts of these pesticides, you know, kind of these low levels over a long period of time. And you can, again, look at the increase in the use of these pesticides and herbicides, and it correlates very closely with the increase in a lot of the chronic diseases we're seeing today. So, you know, so you want to, as much as possible, we can't control all the toxins in our environment, but this is something that we do have some semblance of control over. And then the flip side, too, is the nutrient content. Organic foods, they taste better. You know, if you've ever had organic carrots, they taste a whole lot better than conventional carrots. And the reason being is they've got more nutritional value. So they have done studies that organic foods, you know, fruits and vegetables have more nutritional value. So if you're like us, you know, we've got a family of 5, and it's not in your budget to do 100% organic. This is a list that you can definitely keep, you know, take this with you to the grocery store, but this is called the Dirty Dozen, and it's put out by a group called the Environmental Working Group. This is their website, ewg.org. But these, they tested, and these are the 12 worst fruits and vegetables for pesticide residue. So if you only eat these 12 fruits and vegetables organic, you're going to cut out a significant portion of the pesticides you're exposed to. So this is a great list to follow, and definitely stuff like, I mean, apples and strawberries, these are some of the worst, spinach, tomatoes. These are some, and honestly, you know, if you go to the grocery store, organic, you know, foods are becoming more and more readily available, and the price point is not as expensive. There's not as much of a difference as there used to be. So it's becoming more affordable, and The one thing, if any of you guys have heard me talk about this before, I love to say, people always ask me, they're like, well, it's so expensive, to eat organic, or it's so expensive to eat healthy. And the response I always give is, you have to reframe the question. It's not why is it so expensive to eat healthy, but why is it so cheap to eat conventionally? And when you start to think about it that way, it's kind of like, well, yeah, you can buy cheap food, but there is a cost to it. It's not an immediate cost, but there is a cost to it. And so, so this is one way you can invest in your health that really can decrease the amount of toxic load. If it's absolutely not in the budget, if you look in the resource guide in one of the sections, there's a recipe for a fruit and vegetable wash, and that will take off a lot of the pesticide residue on the outside. And I love it because it's so cheap to make. It's just vinegar, lemon juice, and water. I keep a big spray bottle of it under the sink, and I'll throw my vegetables, in a colander and just spray them down and rinse them off. And so that will take off a lot of the residue. But again, a lot of these pesticides actually get into some of these plants, and so it doesn't take away all of it. But it's better than doing nothing. And then these are the clean 15. So these are the 15 lowest as far as, pesticides and herbicides. So these are the 15 that if, again, it's not in the budget, maybe you don't worry about as much necessarily buying these organic. And so, and if you go to this website, this ewg.org, they've got the full list of, there's about 60 foods that they test. And so they've got the full list of all the different foods. They've also got a lot of great, they've got a sunscreen guide, which sunscreens are most toxic. They've got, on your phone, you can download an app called Skin Deep that you can take with you when you go to the store, and you can scan the barcode of different beauty products, and it'll pop up a score of, how toxic some of the ingredients are in that. So they've got a lot of great resources. All right, we made it through the first section. Are there any questions? Yes.
Protein. Your body only absorbs so much protein at once?
20, yeah. So the question was protein, can your body only absorb so much protein at once? And yes, a lot of the proteins you can't absorb, you can't break down and utilize. I mean, I think it's what was the percentage? The highest, actually, interestingly enough, the highest percentage of proteins that you can utilize actually reside in breast milk. But I think eggs were the next highest source that can be broken down and utilized. And so even whey-based sources, I hate to give you a number. I want to say it's between 30 and 40% of the proteins you're able to break down and utilize. Do you have a number on that?
I don't have the number.
You don't? Okay.
What she was getting at is the
Quantity? Yeah. So I mean, there is a threshold, to where you've got, a lot of it depends on your stomach acid and how, how robust you're able to, break that down. And so, again, I would go back to the rule of eating whole foods, because you will naturally get to a place where if you're eating, whole foods, there's only so much of the, if you sat down and ate a bag of carrots, there are only so many carrots you can eat, or only so much protein you can consume before your body cues and signals you, that's enough, I'm done. And so, so I would encourage you to kind of listen to your body and listen to kind of the cues it gives, and try and get that protein from a whole food source as much as possible. All right, so jumping right into leaky gut. So Hippocrates, father of medicine, said over 2,000 years ago, all disease begins in the gut, which is pretty remarkable, because a lot of the research we're seeing today confirms this idea. And so, there's a huge push. I actually was just listening to an NPR story on the microbiome, and what they're saying is our microbiome is actually like a fingerprint that, what gets populated early on, it's so individualized to us, and we give off an aura of right now, with all of us sitting in this room, we're giving off millions of bacteria. And so they're working on the technology that when we leave this room, for about 30 minutes after we leave, they could test the air and determine if we were in this room or not, which is pretty wild. And so what they're finding is this bacterial population we have, which a lot of it resides on the mucosal surfaces in the body, so like the gut, our sinuses, our skin, in the rectal area. A lot of the mucosal surfaces we have, have this bacterial system. And so a lot of, what they're looking at, kind of the progression of some chronic diseases, they're looking at the gut as kind of the starting place for a lot of those. And so what we're going to talk about in this section is what starts to happen when this system, this barrier system we have in the digestive tract, what happens when this starts to break down. Again, goes back to this idea that I said in the beginning, that the gut we have is not designed for the world that we live in. Our ancestors had, developed over thousands of years, a very particular system that was designed for the world that they existed in. And we have very, very quickly changed that world, and we've very quickly changed, what we're eating, and so, and what we're doing to our bodies. And I think a lot of what we're seeing with chronic diseases is just this maladaptation, to all of these changes. I kind of joke that maybe in 1,000 years, if we continued a diet of Oreos and Coke, maybe eventually we would adapt to that, and our body could handle and eat that and use that for fuel. But where we're at right now, our biochemistry can't handle that, and we're seeing the effects of that with a lot of the chronic diseases today. So how do you know if you have leaky gut? These are a lot of the symptoms of leaky gut. And, one thing I always, people are surprised to hear is that you don't necessarily have to have digestive symptoms to have leaky gut. You don't, of course, if you've got constipation, diarrhea, heartburn, gas, bloating, burping, a lot of those things, either people aren't aware that they have them, or sometimes they don't have those symptoms, in connection with their symptoms. But if you've got headaches, migraines, depression, anxiety, mood, I see this a lot. And this right here, anxiety is a big cue for me when I eat the wrong things, because it triggers, more of a stress state in my body. Weight gain, loss, skin conditions, eczema. 99% of the kids I see with eczema, there's gut issues that go along with that. Acne, hives, rashes, all of these, brain fog, that's a big symptom, especially in connection with dysbiosis or candida. Muscle pain, joint pain, fatigue, allergies. I'll give you guys an example of an interesting case of leaky gut. I had a patient, she was a young woman in her 30s who came in she had a high-stress job. She was a lawyer, had just had a baby. Baby was maybe 8-9 months old. She was breastfeeding, and she got an infection. So she went on antibiotics. I think it was like a sinus infection or something. Went on antibiotics, heavy-duty antibiotics, had to go on 2 rounds to get rid of it. And then all of a sudden, she developed digestive issues. And they tested her, and she had C. diff, Clostridia. So they put her on more antibiotics. And so by the time she got to me, she was still having her digestive issues. She was having a lot of diarrhea. She was having severe joint pain, brain fog. She couldn't focus at work. She wasn't sleeping good. And so, kind of tracing all this back, we started with her diet. She went on a paleo diet. We worked on some gut repair stuff and probiotics, and within about a week, joint pain was gone, and then it took a few more weeks, and then, digestion started to clear up, and her energy started to come back. And, when she was in that process of kind of healing, she figured out some of her big triggers, and if she had a few certain foods, within a few hours, her joints would start hurting again. And so that's kind of an example of it's all related, to kind of the inflammation. And, a lot of it, the antibiotic just kind of pushed her into a state, of inflammation, because it disrupted her gut flora. And so, but you can see the progression of, the joint pain, the fatigue, the brain fog, so all of that started to, and most likely her sinus infection could have been related to, a gut issue that was there to begin with, who knows, and then the antibiotics just made it worse. So we see that a lot in our patients, that it's usually not just one thing, but it's a combination of factors that all add up, and it's kind of the wrong thing and, the wrong timing, and then all of a sudden, boom, symptoms appear. So when so the 4 things we're going to look at here are, we're going to look at the microbiome, we're going to look at absorption, and we're going to look at the immune system in the gut. And so when, like I said, I alluded to the microbiome, which is the bacterial system we have in the body. And this bacteria actually outnumbers our own cells 10 to 1. So we have 10 times the amount of bacteria either in us or on us than we have of our own cells, which is really significant because the fact that this bacteria has its own DNA. And there's this relationship that is developed between us and the bacteria where we're dependent upon one another, which again makes sense with our ancestors because our hunter-gatherer ancestors foraged for food, that was on the forest floor, that was probably partially fermented. They didn't have refrigeration, so they were consuming a lot of bacteria. And there was kind of this love-hate relationship because, bacterial infections were a huge source of death, before antibiotics. And so, so bacteria, we do have kind of a healthy fear of bacteria, but at the same time, that fear has turned into paranoia and, this use of antibacterial hand soaps, every time you enter and exit a room is way overkill. And I think finally they've banned, the use of, this one ingredient, what's it called? Yes, and so the FDA finally banned that, so we're not, so you can wash your hands just fine and, get them clean. We don't need all the antibacterial stuff. But this bacteria, this relationship we have with this bacteria is, it's a commensal, beneficial for both of us relationship. A book I'll recommend, Brain Maker by Dr. David Perlmutter, is a good one if you're interested in kind of this bacterial system and a lot of the current research on that. So when we look at, kind of what builds this system and what destroys this system, we'll start on the side. A lot of things we're doing in our world today that kill our gut flora. And then when you kill the good bacteria in the gut, you give the bad bacteria a chance to thrive. So you get this imbalance, which when you've got an overgrowth of the wrong bacteria, or you've got an overgrowth of candida or yeast, that creates leaky gut. And so, of course, antibiotics will, it's like dropping an atomic bomb, and killing off a lot of our good gut flora. But again, like I mentioned, we get a lot of passive antibiotics in the meat and dairy. So if you're consuming conventional dairy, you're getting antibiotics. If you're drinking milk, that's not organic, you're getting a lot of antibiotics. And so even in, possibly in our water system, so the antibiotics are a huge factor in killing that good bacteria. I mentioned this earlier, artificial sweeteners. Artificial sweeteners will kill your gut flora. And so remember, the digestive tract starts in the mouth. So even, the artificial, sweetener gums and stuff can have an impact, on your flora. And so, they've done studies that women who consume, diet sodas versus regular sodas actually gain about 30% more visceral fat. So the bad fat that packs in around your organs, you gain more of that the more artificial sweeteners you consume. So, so definitely these are just a big no-no. Certain chemicals like chlorine, fluoride, pesticides, and herbicides, those also have an impact on the gut flora. So the more of those you're getting in the foods that you're eating, the more you're going to disrupt your gut. Stress is a big one. When the body is under stress, we go through a lot of physiological changes that we may or may not be aware of. If I were to walk out this door, which is actually, as a side note, this is funny. I've used this example since I started this class 2 years ago, where I say if I walked out this door and I encountered a mountain lion, ha ha, like I'm not going to encounter a mountain lion. Well, one of our doctors actually saw a mountain lion on our property about 6 months ago. So if I really did walk out this door and encounter a mountain lion, my body's going to go into this state of stress, where my palms are going to start sweating, my pupils are going to dilate, my body's going to start shunting blood away from the digestive tract, to my vital organs and to my muscles, preparing me to either fight that animal or to run away. And so, so when you're in that sympathetic state and the body's shunting blood away from the digestive tract and it's turning off the secretion of those digestive enzymes and your stomach acid, then it's going to affect your digestion. So if you're, if you grab your, Arby's meal and you're driving down the road and it's traffic and munching on your fries, you're not going to digest. Number one, fries aren't, there's not a lot of nutritional value, but you're not going to digest that food very well because your body's in that state of stress. Same thing if you're rushing through dinner, snarfing it down to run to the next activity. Your body's not going to be able to digest that food. So you want to encourage more of a parasympathetic state, which is kind of where you slow down, your body shunts blood back to the digestive tract and helps you, digest your food better. And so, so stress can have a big impact on And the way I tell people to remember this, for our ancestors, if they were about to become lunch, then they're not going to waste energy digesting their lunch. And so same thing for us. So things that help build this system, which we have got to be, especially with all of these, some of these things which are out of our control, we have got to be extra vigilant about getting, these good fermented foods in our diet, because this is where we're going to help build that ecosystem back up. So certain foods, yogurt, of course, with no sugar, kefir, fermented sauerkraut, kombucha. Dustin's big on kombucha, and we actually were talking about maybe doing a kombucha class in June. So kombucha is a fermented tea drink that's really, really good. Miso and tempeh are fermented, products. Bragg's apple cider vinegar, is fermented. It's got some of that good, bacteria in it. So all these foods are going to have that good bacteria that's going to help populate the right bacteria in our digestive tract. And the more good bacteria we have, that keeps that bad bacteria from overgrowing. And of course, you can take a probiotic supplement, which, again, depending on, what state you're in, what digestive issues you're having, sometimes we'll recommend different types with different strains of bacteria. Now, just as important, if maybe not even a little bit more important than getting all of this good bacteria, is what you feed that bacteria. So there's something called prebiotics or prebiotic fiber. That this is the fiber that feeds. It's like putting fertilizer in the digestive tract so that the bacteria can grow. And so this again goes back to rule number one. If you're eating all, mostly whole foods, you're going to be getting, in the vegetables you eat all this prebiotic fiber that's going to help, grow that bacterial system. They've actually shown in people, they've taken people who are on more of like a meat and potato sort of diet, and they switch them over to a vegetable-based diet, and within a matter of, 3 to 4 days, the composition of their gut flora starts to change. So what you feed your bacteria makes a big difference as far as what will actually grow. So getting these foods that are high in fiber, specifically this type of fiber called inulin, will help with growing the right bacteria in your digestive tract. All right, since we're running short on time, I'm going to skip through some of this quickly here. This is looking at, in the digestive tract, this is what's happening when we actually use the term leaky gut. This is what's happening, because what we're looking at here, these are the cells that line the small intestine. These cells, these are called enterocytes, and there's only one cell layer thick of these cells between that protects, our bloodstream from the outside world. I tell people you can kind of think of it like a skin. Our skin, even though we can absorb things through our skin, it protects us from the outside world, unless you start to get little cuts in the skin. And if you have little cuts, then whatever's on the surface of your skin, whatever bacteria is there, now has a greater access, to get into the bloodstream. And so what we should see in the digestive tract are these cells that are nice and tightly close together. And they've got these proteins that hold them together. These proteins, if you're interested, they're called zonulin and occludin. And the only reason I mention that is there are a lot of drug companies that are hot on the tail of some of these proteins, because there's so many digestive issues that they're looking for drugs that target them. But these proteins help hold those cells together. So if you have this healthy system, any food that's floating by right here has to go through these cells to get into the bloodstream. So the body has complete control over what gets into the bloodstream and then what gets pushed along. That's in a healthy state. When you start to get leaky gut, what happens is these proteins start to break down. And when these proteins start to break down, you start to get spaces between these cells. Now, all of a sudden, these food particles or the undigested proteins, I think somebody asked, if you don't digest your proteins well, some of those undigested proteins can make their way through this area rather than going through the cell and make their way into the bloodstream. And in the digestive tract, about 60 to 80% of our immune system is in the digestive tract alone. So we've got a lot of our army in this area, ready to protect us, that if anything makes its way through that it shouldn't, the immune system immediately, it's like little Pac-Men that gobble up those things, and then they tag it for the immune system to know when they encounter it again that that's a foreign invader. And so you put a lot of stress on the immune system if you've got leaky gut and you're constantly, getting these particles through that shouldn't be able to make their way through. Not to mention that's triggering a lot of inflammation in the body. You can also get autoimmunity where you actually get these cells actually start to break down. So this is what leaky gut actually looks like at the level of the digestive tract. And if you've got, the wrong bacteria, if you've got, stuff like candida or, the wrong bacteria thriving, that, naturally will induce a state of leaky gut in the body. So you'll see a natural because if the body senses an infection, if we get, say, food poisoning, that's a state where the body goes into a leaky gut state, and you try and clear out whatever infection is there. So you can kind of think about candida and dysbiosis as a really low grade, infection that's there all the time, like a food poisoning that's kind of constantly there, creating that state of leaky gut. Any questions about that? Yes.
So how long would that typically take to correct? Let's say you're on the improved diet,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even, some botanical.
Yeah, it honestly depends on the person, it depends on the state, because if you've got autoimmunity, where your immune system is actually attacking, these cells, then it's a lifelong battle, it's a lifelong journey. And so, so it really, I would say a lot of patients that, initially start to do, and maybe don't have real severe symptoms, a couple months, to correct it. But a lot of people, again, we're born with the gut flora, that gut flora fingerprint, and depending on, we got that fingerprint when we came out of the birth canal from our mothers, and depending on what state our mothers were in and what they transferred to us, or if we were C-section, that is going to change the composition of your gut flora forever. For the rest of your life. Like, I was a C-section baby, and I've always had an issue with candida, and it's for me that is a lifelong battle. I'm always going to have to stay kind of low sugar, stay away from a lot of that stuff. Otherwise, it's going to thrive. So a lot of it it kind of depends on the person. And for a lot of people, what you'll see here in a second, the things that trigger leaky gut, if you go too much back to your normal, if you're eating a lot of breads, if you're eating a lot of sugar, if you're under a lot of stress, it's more of kind of like a teeter-totter sort of balance, where a lot of people initially, when you can correct the leaky gut, it's not all of a sudden things are magically fixed and you never have a problem again. A lot of times it's kind of a steady state, a steady balance, where you're still going to have to maintain a good diet, maintain, some certain supplements to help maintain that balance. So, but, and again, a lot of it depends on how long you've had it too, because some people, have had leaky gut a lot longer than they're aware of. And so correcting it isn't just kind of an overnight sort of thing. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right, so like I said, 60 to 80% of the immune system is concentrated in the gut. So what breaks down this gut lining? What is it that causes some of those proteins to break down? Well, there's a protein in gluten called gliadin, which, whether you're celiac or not, this protein can break down the lining of your digestive tract, and it affects those proteins that hold it together. Now, not everybody necessarily, when they eat gluten, has a reaction, and what I tell people is sometimes it's only a matter of time. If you are again young, eating wheat, you might not be aware of the inflammation it's causing, or again your body just might be in a healthy repair sort of state, so you don't necessarily feel the effects of it. But for most people, that protein creates sort of breakdown in the gut. Stress, like I mentioned, reduces blood flow, alters motility, and it also increases permeability in the gut. Dysbiosis, this is the overgrowth of the wrong bacteria, or overgrowth of candida. That's a huge one. I see that very, very often with a lot of people, that dysbiosis state. Environmental contaminants, we've talked about food additives, preservatives, pesticides, all these chemicals, and then certain drugs too. And like I said, for most people, it's usually not just one thing. It's somebody that comes in that's under stress, that's maybe eating a lot of sugar, eating a lot of wheat, they get sick, they go on an antibiotic, and then all of a sudden, boom, they've got dysbiosis. So it's usually a combination of different factors that lead to this leaky gut sort of state. So what does this have to do with the rest of our symptoms? Like I mentioned in that case that I told you, our immune system has messengers, which, immunology can get pretty muddy pretty fast. But all you really need to know is that if you're triggering inflammation in the gut, if you've got inflammatory bowel disease, that could be triggering inflammation in the thyroid or inflammation in the brain. Leaky gut very often equals leaky brain. You could have arthritis, inflammation in the joints. Inflammation in the muscles, adrenals. There's a lot of this message of inflammation starts to be carried via cytokines throughout the rest of the body. And so what starts off as inflammation in the gut can now start to lead to this whole body symptom profile that a lot of times is what we see when we see our patients, which is where your question comes in. How long does it take to fix leaky gut? It really depends on how far progressed and how kind of inflamed the person is to how long it takes to correct it. Okay, I'm going to skip through some of this. So how do we heal the gut? If we know we've got an issue, what do we do to heal the gut? And again, my disclaimer to this is you have to look at all the symptoms. There are a lot of factors that play into this, whether the person has autoimmunity, nutrient deficiencies. That's why we do a full nutrient profile on everybody, because if you're missing some key nutrients that help heal the gut, then you're not going to be able to get well just by taking certain foods out of your diet. Genetics play a big role in all of this. Severity, so there are a lot of things that play into this. But as a general rule, there's kind of a guideline that you can follow to help heal the gut. And this is called kind of the 4R program. You can remove, replace, reinoculate, and repair. And this book right here, this is another great one that Dr. Jeffrey Bland wrote, The Disease Delusion, and I would highly recommend reading this. It's a great, great introduction into alternative medicine. And he also talks about the 4R program in his book. So step number 1, remove. This is essentially what we've talked about into this class up to this point. This is the step that every single person, I would encourage you to play with on your own. Try removing certain foods out of your diet. Remove sugar, remove wheat, remove dairy. Start taking all these things, out of your diet and see how you feel. Look for food sensitivities or food allergies. Go organic, remove pesticides, remove some of your environmental toxins, which if you have the resource guide, there's a whole list of different environmental toxins, what we're exposed to in those, so I would highly recommend. There's also a list of different drugs and what nutrients they deplete. So if you're taking a particular drug, cross-reference that with some of the nutrient deficiencies that we commonly see with certain drugs. So step number 1, like I said, take things out of your diet and see how you feel. Play with that on your own. But sometimes, for a lot of people, that's enough. They can change their diet, their symptoms they start to go away, they feel a lot better, and that's all they ever have to do. But for some people, depending on how long they've had their symptoms, you have to move on to kind of the second step where you start replacing key steps in the digestive tract. So this is where we start talking about low stomach acid. If you've got, like we mentioned, the symptom of reflux, or if you burp after you eat, or you do a lot of clearing your throat, if you've got bloating, if you've got undigested food material in your stools, all of these, or if you eat maybe a smaller meal but you feel really, really full, a lot of times that's, low stomach acid or lack of digestive enzymes. And so, interesting, side note, does anybody know the #1 condition that's associated with low stomach acid? Any thoughts? Any guesses? GERD? Well, that's one, but what actually causes low stomach acid is hypothyroidism, which makes sense. Thyroid regulates metabolism. If thyroid's low, you're probably not going to be needing to metabolize a lot of foods. And so if you've got low thyroid, very often low stomach acid goes hand in hand with that. And so, in fact, some of my patients, that's their cue as to how they know that their thyroid is low, is they start feeling really full, they're not digesting their food very well. So what do? If you've got low stomach acid, the easiest thing is just to chew your food better. Take some of the stress off the stomach, chew your food more thoroughly. Like I mentioned, bitter herbs, the taste of bitter stimulates the release of hydrochloric acid in the stomach. And so, so you can do bitter herbs. 15 minutes before eating, and that can stimulate, the acid in the stomach and help with your digestion. You can do kind of the same thing with apple cider vinegar. This is where I start a lot of people because it's an easy, inexpensive strategy that can decrease bloating, help you digest your food better. Sometimes we'll move people on to bromelain or papaya, some of the enzymes, or betaine. This is probably one of the strongest we use, betaine HCl, and that's actually replacing some of the stomach acid. So I do caution, if you use this on your own, go slowly. I've had some patients that do this on their own that end up going too high, and they end up in the emergency room because they think they're having a heart attack. So it will create more of an acidic environment in the stomach, but you want to go slowly with that. And again, I always say start with low stomach acid, but if that's not enough, you can also add digestive enzymes. And these are some of the pancreatic enzymes that you can get in supplement form, that can help with your digestion. And, again, like I said, increasing acid in the stomach will naturally stimulate the release of these enzymes. But if you're doing a gut repair program, sometimes doing both at the same time can really be of benefit.
So would drinking some water with apple cider vinegar while you're cooking supper?
Yeah. That's what I have a lot of people do. Do a jigger of it. Start with maybe a tablespoon, work up to an ounce. Just kind of see how you do with it. And you can mix it with water, a little bit of water. But that's a great way to naturally that's why, if you go on the internet, there are all the different apple cider vinegar stories of, how it helps people. That's how it's helping. And you can make I've seen recipes for little apple cider vinegar cocktails, which is kind of fun if you drink a cocktail while you're eating dinner.
Does it affect your blood sugar, the apple cider vinegar?
Yeah, it can decrease your blood sugar.
Yeah. It wouldn't increase it.
No, it shouldn't.
Yeah.
No, it shouldn't. I can't think of any reason why it would. So. Reinoculate, third step. So this is, looking at that bacterial system. And a lot of times 2 and 3 go hand in hand together. This is getting all that good bacteria back in your system. So it's the good prebiotic fiber, the good probiotic supplements. At a minimum, 5 to 10 billion for probiotics. For most people, especially if you've got digestive issues, that's closer to 50 to 100 billion. So just kind of depends on, and of course, getting a lot of the good probiotics in foods, the fermented foods. And then last step is repair. This is where doing nutrient testing is really important because you can see which of these nutrients you're low in. And, a lot of times with patients with, digestive issues, with, Crohn's, celiac, ulcerative colitis, a lot of times we'll actually have to do IVs of some of these nutrients to build their levels up. Because when you've got chronic leaky gut and you've got chronic digestive issues, you're not going to absorb your nutrients as well. And so when you don't absorb your nutrients as well, you can't heal the gut. And so it becomes kind of this vicious cycle. Because one thing I didn't mention when we were going through leaky gut, the cells that line your digestive tract replace at least every 5 to 7 days. So every week we have a whole new lining to our digestive tract. So these cells are a high turnover rate sort of cell, and so there's a lot of energy, that is needed for, the DNA, synthesis and the repair of these cells, which is where the nutrients come into play. So zinc is a really important one for any sort of, cells that turn over quickly. The hair, skin and nails, digestive tract, all of those rely on zinc. This is where, interesting, remember how I mentioned the eczema very often is a gut issue? Well, you can see early gut issues in the quality of the nails and the skin and the hair. If you've got really thin, dull hair, or really, thin nails that break easily, that's a sign that you're maybe not absorbing the minerals that you need, and that there might be something going on in the digestive system. B vitamins, especially the methylated form, these are needed for DNA synthesis and repair, so really critically important for healing the digestive system. Magnesium, almost everybody should be taking magnesium. It's just amazing. But it's also needed for protein synthesis and DNA, synthesis. So real important for gut healing. L-glutamine. This one. Put a star by this one. This one is the amino acid that is primary fuel for those enterocytes, those cells that line our digestive tract. So almost every gut repair program you do will include glutamine, but that's a real important amino acid. These are the supplements that help with balancing inflammation, because if your gut stays inflamed, it's going to be really hard to heal, and so I tell people it's kind of like a grass field. If your field's on fire, you're going to have a hard time, repairing the soil. And so, so these are all really great anti-inflammatory substances. One of the best is curcumin, turmeric. It balances, some of these factors, NF-kappa B, some of the Th17 cells which contribute to autoimmunity. It's really, really important. So much so that I have a lot of patients that their conventional doctor is putting them on turmeric because the research is so good behind it. So turmeric, and then this one down here, resveratrol, works in a similar mechanism, but they are great for reducing inflammation in the gut and in the body. Vitamin D is needed to activate the immune system, so it activates a lot of, our genes that regulate the immune system. So, so if you've got an imbalance in gut flora, and since most of our immune system, 60 to 80%, resides in the gut, this is a real important one for maintaining that proper gut flora balance. Glutathione, this one is one of my personal favorites. It's something that the body naturally makes, but it's one of the most potent antioxidants in the body, but it's also the body's main detoxifier. So we make glutathione to help pull out toxins like mercury and, toxicants in the environment. And a lot of people we see today are low in glutathione because we just are exposed to so much that we are, our body's not able to make enough, to kind of, keep up with the toxic load that we have. And so we do this one via IV, and our head nurse, Chris, always teases me because the first time I got a glutathione IV, it was just like, oh, like I had like energy. I was like bouncing off the walls. And so I try and go at least once a week or once every other week to get an injection. And he calls me a junkie. He's like, we're going to find you in the closet shooting up glutathione one of these days. He's like, we got to give you your fix. But, again, my genetics, I don't recycle glutathione very well, so it makes sense. Omega-3 fish oils, we've talked about those, how those reduce inflammation. So where do I start? We've made it to the end. Where do I start with all of this? Because this is a lot of information. And so these are the top 5 things that I tell people, pick 1, pick 2, and just slowly work your way through this list. Because the goal with this is to not go on a diet or a program or a detox, but to make lifestyle changes. And so, my number 1 is get rid of sugar. Start with, all the obvious sugar in your diet. If you buy ice cream or you stop at Starbucks, kind of replace those habits, but then work your way through all the hidden sugar that's in all of these foods that you might be consuming. Number 2, significantly reduce your additives and preservatives. So best way to do that is don't buy anything in a box. But again, even if you do, choose the organic, natural versions which don't have a lot of these chemicals. Number 3, increase your good fats and proteins. If you're decreasing sugar, you want to feed your fat burning engine. So, avocado, coconut oil, MCT oil, nuts and seeds, all of those grass-fed meats are going to be a good way to increase your good fats and proteins. Decrease simple carbohydrates, so pasta, crackers, anything, that's kind of those simple carbohydrates, chips. Try and decrease those out of your diet as much as possible. And here's a little tip. If you can't quite kick the carbs, or if maybe you're somebody that you need a little bit of carbs, your body is more insulin sensitive after 3 p.m. So if you're going to do carbs, you will better utilize those carbs and those sugar later in the day. So, so you can kind of time some, how you do carbs. And then number 5, drink more water. Everybody can do that. I always carry around, these are jars that are 32 ounces, and so I try and get, this has vitamin C in it, but I try and get at least 3 of these a day. So the rule of thumb is at a minimum, take your body weight, divide it in half, and that's the number of ounces you should get per day, minimum. And so, if you can sip on it throughout the day, and if you carry it around with you, eventually you'll get tired of carrying it, and you'll drink it. So, but drink more water, and that's like I said, a great first step also. All right. We made it to the end. Does anybody have any questions?
You talk about
Yeah.
the acid reflux. Is that a common symptom?
Oh, yeah.
Like you feel like you always need to clear your throat.
Yeah.
Like there's something stuck in.
Yeah. It's a very common symptom. And again, young people too. There was a girl that I saw that she was having a lot of bloating, a lot of digestive issues, no acid reflux, no burning, but she started noticing that when after she would run, her vocal cords would be affected. And when she went to the GI doctor, he diagnosed her with acid reflux and wanted to put her on, one of the acid blocking medications. And she was like, well, what do you think? And I'm like, well, we do a test with the betaine, where we build people up with their acid. And an average, person with low stomach acid, I would say, could maybe take 2 to 3 of the betaine. She got up to 8 of them. So she had really severely low stomach acid. And as soon as she started increasing that, bloating started to decrease. Her digestion got a lot better. And so if she had done the acid reflux meds, it would have just compounded an already bad issue. So sometimes it's not the classic burning after you eat. Sometimes it is the clearing throat or,
They call it silent reflux.
Yeah. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. Yay, I'm glad you came.
Hi.
Hi.
You should have a class on water.
Oh, seriously.
I don't know what to drink, what's okay to drink, what's not to drink.